Good morning, Year 9. Welcome to this video on personification in the text Jekyll and Hyde. So let's get started. So obviously you've been reading this text. I don't know whether you've noticed, but you might have noticed that sometimes things that are not human are described as though they are. So in this lesson we are going to dive into personification and take a look at examples from the story. So, cartoons and personification. If you watched cartoons when you were younger or you enjoy them now, you may remember that in cartoons almost anything can be alive. For example, a pair of scissors may sprout eyes and start chatting with the paper it is about to cut. When something that is not alive is described as if it is human, this is called personification. In literature, personification is often used to help convey emotions and make scenes feel more intense. For example, in the text, when Dr. Jekyll speaks about his evil side, he says, "Had been long caged, he came out roaring." Since anger or evil is not actually alive, it cannot be caged or come out roaring. So let's take a look at a few more examples from the story. So this is our task. So think of 3 examples of personification of your own, but extra points if they are examples from the text. This is just so that I can see that you've understood what personification actually is. Okay, the legs of time. One straightforward example of personification is when the narrator describes Sir Danvers' death. We learned that time ran on, thousands of pounds were offered in reward, for the death of Sir Danvers was resented as a public injury. This one might be a bit tricky, but can you spot the personification? Here is a hint. Does time have legs? Time does not have legs because it is not alive. However, in this passage, time is described as running. This is personification because the concept of time is described as though it is alive. Okay, next task for you. Can you please evaluate this use of personification? Why did the author include it? What is the purpose of personification here? So this is going to help us with our analytical skills when it comes to those ever important piece paragraphs. All right, let's move on to ghosts and cancer then. So now let's take a look at a slightly more complicated example of personification. This one comes when Mr. Utterson is thinking about what could be troubling Jekyll. He knows that something is up and thinks about how Jekyll has been an adult, nothing like the wild youth he once was. He decides that Jekyll must be paying for some past mistakes and thinks, it must be that, the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace. So where is the personification here? Take a look at how sin is being described. Our speaker says that the ghost of some sin must be haunting Jekyll. Since a concept like sin does not have a soul, it cannot have a ghost. This means that saying the ghost of a sin is haunting Jekyll is an example of personification. But this passage has another example of personification as well. When the narrator comments that the problem is the cancer of some concealed disgrace, this is personification because he is suggesting that the cancer can grow on a disgrace. Since disgraces do not have cells that divide out of control, they therefore cannot get cancer, and therefore this is an example of personification. So, why is this personification? This particular quotation. I want you to kind of delve a bit more deeper, develop this point, think about why Stevenson might have included this. What connotations do we have with the word cancer? All right, let's move on. Evoking emotion. Okay. So, personification is not just something to fill the pages. Authors use personification to evoke emotion and force the reader to feel and think more deeply. So, this is an example of analysis of personification. Um, we're thinking about the effect of the reader, which is also taking it one step further. So let's take a look at what Stevenson is pushing us to think in the following example of personification. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night. I feel that my days are numbered. So why is this such a powerful quotation in the book? I wonder. Well, first, let's point out the personification. In this passage, Dr. Lanyon tells us that sleep has left him. Since sleep is not alive, it cannot make a choice to leave, so this is personification. The next example is when he tells us that the deadliest terror sits by him. So, why is this personification? What can you say about this quotation here? The deadliest terror sits by him. Okie dokie. And I'm going to model some analysis for you here because I think this is a skill that we need to begin mastering. It's not a case of answering a question now and leaving out analysis. Basically, if you write an answer for me now, which doesn't include analysis, it's just not good enough. So let's model some first, just so that we really know what we're talking about. So, now that we have identified the personification, let's examine how these examples evoke a deeper emotion for the reader. So let's first look at the personification of sleep as having left Dr. Lanyon. Sleep is described as though it has power and control to ruin his life by simply leaving. Instead of Dr. Lanyon being in command of what happens and in command of his life, there are clearly other forces at play. Even sleep itself has come to life and decided to run away as a form of torment. The next personification is when terror is described as sitting by Dr. Lanyon at all hours of the day and night. This is pretty creepy. In fact, anything sitting by you all hours of the day and night doesn't sound so positive, unless maybe it's a pile of money, some ice cream, or a good friend. Those all sound okay. It isn't money or delicious food, though. It's terror, deadly terror that is sitting by him constantly. By personifying terror as something that seems to be sitting nearby him, Stevenson helps us to understand just how scary and horrible Dr. Lanyon's situation is. So I hope that gives you a good example of some language analysis. This is the type of thing I would like to see in your work. It is a difficult skill and it can only be improved by practice. So if you've got any questions, please just ask me. Okay, let's just have our apply section of the lesson then. So mini quiz, answer these questions just to see whether we've understood today's new knowledge about personification as a whole and personification in the text. And then I'll put the answers on Teams for you. And if I don't, please remind me. And finally, let's review. So, personification is when a non-human thing is described with human characteristics. This technique helps the reader understand the emotions and feelings of characters. In the text by Stevenson, there are many solid examples of personification. One example is when the narrator tells us that time ran on. Another example is when Mr. Utterson describes Jekyll's past mistakes as a ghost, and as having cancer. When Dr. Lanyon tells us that sleep left him and deadly terror sits by him at all hours, we get a strong example of how personification can help convey a character's emotions. So, can you write down for me one interesting piece of context that we could link to this lesson? So remember, context is any external influence on the text that influences it, basically. So it could be something to do with the Victorian period and life during Victorian times, something like that, or maybe something actually that occurred in Stevenson's own life. Can we find Stevenson's biography anywhere on the internet and use information from that to kind of help us understand why he wrote this text? Okay, so that's it then. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, any questions, just ask.